if Boris gets an election date on the slate and he gets a Brexit deal agreed in Parliament, it would almost, one could say, a khaki election. Do you think he could get a sizable majority? Is that what you would bank on if he goes to the country with a deal behind him?
I don't think Manus would be banking on anything. I think looking at the polling that we can see at the moment, I mean, certainly he's ahead, but how that would actually break out in terms of an election result, I think is anybody's guess at this stage. I mean, certainly the numbers would suggest that at this point that he would get a majority. But I think given the predilection for tactical voting, given the split of opposition amongst the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, what might happen with some of the other smaller parties, then I think it will be a really unpredictable election, just as the last few have been in the UK. So I don't think we'd be banking on anything, but certainly he would be going into that from a position of significant strength relative to where he was just a few weeks ago.
So how are you approaching your UK equity strategy then, given still all the lingering uncertainty? Well,
I think within our UK portfolios, the managers are generally positioned for a more favourable outcome for Brexit. So over the last 6 to 8 weeks, that's generally been a pretty reasonable experience for us. We've seen a strong recovery in domestic cyclicals, more domestically exposed stocks, and that's generally been pretty favourable. Within our strategies, that are perhaps more sort of long-term quality type approaches, I think they've generally been sort of narrowing their sort of underweight to the UK as well in recent times. And so I think generally speaking, across the board within ASI, we're sort of positioned for a more favourable outcome for Brexit.
OK, so if the base case is a more favourable outcome for Brexit, do you think the run-up in sterling, if we go into an election cycle, as you say, maybe I'm misreading the 10% lead that the Tories have in the polls, and as you say, it can change very, very quickly. Does that cap, if we go to an election, does that cap this current move up that we've had of 5-6% in sterling over the past 5 weeks?
Well, I think there's going to be there'll be a general sense of uncertainty, I think, Manus, if we go into an election. So the positive out case is we end up with Boris for positive for markets, I must say, a positive outcome for Boris. He ends up with a working majority. We end up with a functioning government again. We're able to make progress on policy across the board, not just Brexit, but also domestic policy, and that's a significant change from where we've been over the last 2 or 3 years. That's the positive out case. I guess the downside risk, and I think investors would also still be looking at this, is what happens in terms of an outcome which they're not expecting. If we do have an election, it does open up the possibility for a Corbyn government, for a coalition of Lib Dems, SNP and Labour to form a government if things don't work out as the polls suggest they currently do. And I think that is an outcome which investors would be extremely cautious about. So I think there'd be a sort of a welcome to some degree. But I think, again, if you think back to the last election, the polls are expecting Theresa May to win by about 150 seats when she called the election. They were expecting her to win by somewhere between 50 and 80 the day before the election, and in the end she was only able to get a majority through bringing the DUP into play. So I think we just have to be a little bit cautious, but I think overall we would probably welcome the opportunity for the deadlock and indecision of the last few years to be broken.